Pompeii did not die slowly. On its final morning, people opened shops, prepared food, argued over money, visited baths, and walked streets they had known all their lives. By the next morning, much of that world was buried beneath meters of volcanic debris. The strange part is that the killer was visible from almost everywhere. Mount Vesuvius rose beyond the city, dominating the landscape. Yet to the people of Pompeii, it was not a monster waiting to wake. It was simply part of the horizon. Pompeii was a busy Roman city near the Bay of Naples, filled with stone streets, fountains, temples, workshops, bakeries, taverns, bathhouses, gardens, and expensive villas. Its walls carried advertisements, political slogans, jokes, insults, and ordinary graffiti left by ordinary people. 17 years earlier, in AD 62, a powerful earthquake had badly damaged the city. Repairs were still visible when the final disaster came. Earthquakes were not unknown in the region, and repeated tremors did not automatically tell residents that a volcanic catastrophe was approaching. Then, in AD 79, the pattern changed. The ground shook again. Somewhere beneath Vesuvius, pressure that had been building underground reached a point at which rock above the magma could no longer contain it. Around midday, the mountain erupted with extraordinary force. A towering column of gas, ash, and volcanic rock rose above Vesuvius and expanded high in the atmosphere. Across the Bay of Naples, Pliny the Younger would later compare its shape to a great pine tree. At first, the sight may have been more confusing than terrifying. There was no modern emergency warning, no volcanic observatory, no phone alert explaining what was happening. People had to interpret an event most of them had never seen and did not understand. Then material began falling from the sky. White pumice and pieces of volcanic rock rained down over Pompeii. At first they were an inconvenience. Soon they became dangerous. Streets began to disappear beneath a growing layer of loose stone. Some residents reacted quickly and fled. That decision probably saved them. But leaving was not simple. Families had children, elderly relatives, possessions, animals, and no clear information about whether the eruption would stop in minutes or grow worse. Others stayed inside, believing thick walls and roofs offered protection. It was a reasonable instinct during falling debris. But the houses of Pompeii were not designed to carry the enormous weight that was now accumulating above them. Hour after hour, the pumice kept falling. Roofs groaned. Tiles shifted. Walls cracked. Eventually, some buildings began to collapse, crushing people who had chosen their homes as shelters. The city itself was slowly becoming a trap. Moving through the streets became increasingly difficult. Imagine trying to run across loose stones that reached your ankles, then your knees, while more pieces continued to fall. Every trip toward a gate became slower, darker, and more dangerous. The eruption also transformed daylight. Ash spread through the atmosphere, blocking the sun. Lamps and torches became necessary. People who knew every street could suddenly struggle to see where they were going. Across the bay, Pliny the Elder, a Roman commander and famous naturalist, saw the enormous cloud. He first approached out of scientific curiosity, but after receiving a request for help, the mission became a rescue attempt. He ordered ships toward the danger zone. Conditions near Vesuvius were becoming increasingly hostile. Falling debris made navigation difficult, and the coastline itself was affected by the eruption. Pliny eventually reached Stabiae, south of Pompeii, where he tried to reassure frightened people around him. Back in Pompeii, evening turned into night, although by then the difference barely mattered. The city was already buried beneath a deep blanket of pumice. Buildings continued to fail, and every hour reduced the number of safe places left. Some people still tried to escape. Archaeology has preserved traces of lives interrupted in motion, possessions carried in haste, valuables gathered together, and bodies found along routes that once led toward safety. Survival could depend on leaving at exactly the right time. But the most dangerous phase had not yet arrived. The great eruption column above Vesuvius could remain standing only while hot gas and debris rose strongly enough to support it. Eventually parts of that column began to collapse. When an eruption column collapses, the danger changes completely. Instead of material simply falling from above, scorching clouds of ash, gas, and fragmented rock can race outward along the ground. These are pyroclastic density currents. Herculaneum, closer to Vesuvius, was struck with devastating force. Pompeii lay farther away, and the earliest currents did not immediately destroy everyone still inside. For a short time, the city remained alive beneath the darkness. That delay may have been cruel. Anyone who had survived the falling pumice could have believed the worst was finally ending. The shower weakened. The city was damaged, but perhaps dawn would bring rescue. Instead, a new threat was moving toward them. Early the next morning, pyroclastic currents reached Pompeii. Hot ash and gas surged through streets, around buildings, and into spaces where people had sheltered. For many of those still inside the city, there was no realistic route of escape left. The exact cause of death was not identical for every victim. Some had already been killed by collapsing structures. Others were overwhelmed by the later volcanic currents, where heat, ash, and toxic conditions made survival impossible. And then the city went silent. Houses, shops, temples, gardens, streets, food, tools, wall paintings, and human bodies disappeared beneath layers of volcanic material. Pompeii had not been erased from existence. It had been sealed away. The eruption devastated more than Pompeii. Herculaneum and settlements across the region were also buried or destroyed. Pliny the Elder died at Stabiae. His nephew survived and later wrote the eyewitness letters that became the most famous ancient account of the disaster. For the survivors, there was no simple return to normal. Emperor Titus organized relief in Campania, but Pompeii itself was never rebuilt as a functioning Roman city. The landscape had changed, and the buried streets gradually slipped out of everyday memory. Centuries passed. The volcanic layers that had destroyed Pompeii now performed an accidental second role. They protected it. Walls remained standing. Frescoes stayed on walls. Everyday objects survived in places where they had been left almost 2,000 years earlier. When large-scale excavations began in the 18th century, investigators were not uncovering only grand temples or statues of emperors. They found bedrooms, kitchens, bakeries, bars, workshops, gardens, and street signs. Pompeii preserved something rarer: ordinary life. Bread had been carbonized and preserved. Amphorae remained where goods had been stored. Graffiti still carried names, insults, romantic messages, business notices, and political campaigning. Suddenly, ancient Romans stopped looking like distant marble figures and began looking like people. But the most haunting discoveries were empty spaces in the hardened volcanic deposits. Human bodies buried in ash had decomposed over time, leaving cavities that preserved the shape of the people who had died there. In 1863, archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli developed the famous technique of pouring plaster into these voids before excavating them fully. When the surrounding material was removed, the forms of victims appeared. Bodies caught in the final positions in which death had found them. More than 1,000 victims have been discovered in the excavated areas of Pompeii, although that number does not represent everyone who died in the disaster. Many residents escaped, others died outside the excavated city, and some areas remain unexplored. The casts became symbols of Pompeii because they removed the comfortable distance between us and the ancient world. A disaster from nearly 2,000 years ago suddenly has posture, clothing, hands, faces, and the unmistakable shape of individual human beings. There is an irony at the center of Pompeii. Vesuvius destroyed the city so completely that it preserved details that ordinary history usually loses. The same ash that killed and buried people protected the evidence of how they lived. That is why Pompeii is more than the story of a volcano. It is a frozen fragment of Roman society. Wealth beside poverty, public spectacle beside private life, political ambition beside crude graffiti, all stopped at almost the same moment. On its final morning, nobody in Pompeii knew they were living inside a future archaeological site. They were simply going to work, eating, buying, selling, arguing, and making plans. Then Vesuvius turned one ordinary day into a message that survived for almost 2,000 years.